So welcome to the third year of the Independent Accountability Panel's review of the Energy Charter disclosures. And in starting the meeting, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respect to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. So thank you very much, Jemena, for your disclosure, and congratulations on your commitment to the Energy Charter and the Better Together initiatives. For the panel, we have Cassandra Goldie from ACOS and Andrew Richards from the EUAA, who you know. Just by way of introduction, it is regrettable that in 2021, we're still having to talk about the impact of COVID-19 on individuals, families and businesses around Australia, including energy businesses, as well as natural disasters in some areas, the upsurge in housing pressures around the country and other economic pressures. So as a result, we consider that the themes for this year's report are likely to be similar to those of last year: affordability of essential services, transition to net zero emissions by 2050 or preferably sooner, with the consequent key issue that no customer should be left behind in that transition, particularly as a factor of affordability. So these themes have generally been confirmed by the stakeholder forums that we've already held. So we're here to discuss this with you and the other CEOs of signatory companies and to get your perspective. So we have some questions for you, Frank, but I'd like to pass over to you in the beginning just to give you the opportunity to highlight any key points from your disclosure, and then we can open it up for discussion. So thank you.
Claire, thank you. I'd also like to acknowledge your welcome to country. We're delighted to be here today. You know me, I think. Let me just introduce Sean Redden, who's the Executive General Manager for our Jemena Networks. He looks after both our distribution businesses in Sydney and Melbourne. And we've also, though I can't see him online, got Anne, who is our Strategy Manager working for Sean in the Jemena Networks group as well. And they're both beaming in from Melbourne and Sydney, and I'm here in Perth at the moment. We represent the shareholders, State Grid, Singapore Power, and their Australian assets that we manage on their behalf across the country, and obviously the two signatory members, Avita and Jemena, that are a part of the Energy Charter. I concur with you. This is the third session that we've had with the panel, and only one of those has been face-to-face. So I genuinely hope that the next one is face-to-face again. It has been a pretty extraordinary year. I just wanted to pick up a couple of things I think that we're particularly proud of and some of the areas that we're continuing to focus on. You know, clearly the pandemic has had issues, as you've indicated, around affordability, and that often obviously hits the most vulnerable in the community first. And it is that focus that we've got on assisting vulnerable people that I think is something that we're particularly proud of within the business. And there's two areas that I'd probably call out in that space. One is our long-standing relationship with Uniting that started back in 2015 and 16. We've got 2 or 3 iterations now going to our third iteration of the program arrangement that we've got with them. And that is purely focused on really trying to connect with vulnerable customers and communicating them to them through non-traditional means, whether it's you know, community groups, support groups, training groups, TAFE, and we've found that's been very, very effective. And Uniting as a group is really probably one of the largest non-profit organisations. So we're very pleased with our relationship there. And I think the other thing I'd call out is the Voices for Power that we've been working with a number of organisations. But that's really training trainers. It's looking at bringing people that are bilingual that we can train in areas of energy systems, things around bills, things about efficiency and management, and using them as a means of actually communicating much more intimately with vulnerable customers. The areas of innovation, I think we'd be pretty pleased with. We're doing some good work, I think, trialling electric vehicle charging across our network with a number of other DNSPs that have signed up to an ARENA-funded program. We're also doing, I think, good work in keeping our hosting capacity limits for distributed energy resources at a point when we're not curtailing the export of customers that are connecting their solar panels onto our systems. So I think there's good work being done in that area. And I think the other really important piece of work for us over the last, I think, 12 to 18 months is refreshing the purpose of the organisation, particularly around net zero by 2050. And we have stated that we've got an ambition supported by the board back 12 months ago that we put in place. That led to a real refresh of the purpose of the business and how we play an active part in the transition of Australia's energy systems and infrastructure towards that net zero target that we've all got as an ambition. That's been important, I think, to give people a real purpose to the changing policy framework and a lot of the noise that goes on in the public around that. But particularly, I think, the fact is that we're playing not only to people's normal aspirations for work, but we're playing to things that are really meaningful, and they want to see an organisation like ours that's got an ability to play a critical role, standing up and being active in that space. So I think that's worked very well for us. 2 or 3 areas that we continue to focus on, I think, is vulnerable customers. They'll continue to be a subject. There is a residential customers, but particularly, I think, as we look across what's happening in New South Wales and Victoria, C&I, commercial, the small commercial businesses, small enterprises, obviously been heavily hit. I'm not sure exactly how we come to terms with that as a country, but that certainly could be one of the things that, I don't think businesses can cross-subsidise businesses, but it'll certainly be something that is important for us to understand how we can play a part in. I think as we face into a very different future, it's going to change pretty dramatically, probably more quickly than we expect. I think we see ourselves, because we're funded through a regulatory framework, as really being in a position of being trusted advisors, and how we continue to work with customers to actually build that relationship through different areas is going to be something that we continue to focus on. And as a relatively small network compared to some of the others, I think we continue to struggle and will continue to focus on costs. That's important. They translate through to the charges that we put to our retailers and in turn to end user customers. So that will continue to be a focus. So perhaps I'll pause there and just start to open up for your questions.
Thanks very much, Frank. Andrew?
Thanks, folks, and I'd just like to acknowledge I'm on Wurundjeri land today. Thanks for your continuing leadership and commitment to the Energy Charter, and I know that you've played a particularly strong role in Better Together initiatives, and we'll sort of circle back to that in a minute. There's some really good segmentation of your customer base on page 5, and it's pretty clear that from that then it seems like you're really sort of digging into the data, and I know that you do that from other experiences with you. Are you seeing then in that data some early warning signs of what you would consider to be debt stress or vulnerability? And if you're seeing those early warning signs, what do you think we can do to get ahead of the game rather than sort of pick people up and they fall over? Are there things that you're seeing that we can be doing to get ahead of that so they don't fall in the first place?
I think probably Sean and I can pick this one up. I think you're probably aware that we've been doing research through the Energy Charter that's been done by Deloitte, and it's specifically looking, I think we're into our 4th iteration of that now. So it's been longitudinally looking at the impact of different segments of customers through the course of particularly the pandemic. I think in the most recent wave 4 iteration, we've seen that, certainly I think optimism has dropped. There's about 30% of people that are optimistic. I think 70%, I think, feel, this is broadly, and this is across the customer base, randomly chosen of about 3,000 people that I think fit across South Australia, Queensland, Victoria, New South Wales. 70% of those feel that there's going to be a lasting impact through COVID. I think 50% are feeling more stressed, and 40% is certainly going to be spending less on non-essential expenditure going forward. I think the obvious categories that are being the most heavily hit are the renters, the single parents, young adults, and international students. They're significantly at stress. With some, and obviously the CALD, I think, area as well. The way, there's many answers to the question. I think one of the things that we're practically doing is obviously reinforcing the intuition in terms of which sectors we think are being most affected. And one of the things that we're obviously doing through, I think, uniting in the Voices for Power, along with broadening that in the Energy Charter, because Uniting is now establishing a relationship, I think, with other businesses, particularly the distribution businesses across the country, is to make sure that we are communicating to vulnerable people that may not have that digital language or energy literacy in common language, to make sure that they're aware of the things that they can step up to and be supported in. So some of the work that we've done in that area already, there's about 100 odd customers that were able to realise, something like $70,000 of $69,000 of value and support that was there that wouldn't have otherwise been unlocked. So I think we've recognised within the Energy Charter, I think that that's the first place to start, which is to make sure that people are getting access to the support that's already available. The education around energy efficiency, particularly then also what the bill means, what sort of offers having the confidence to be able to step up and have the conversations with retailers to ensure that they're getting the best offers that are on the table, I think is the other thing that sort of follows naturally. But I think, it's an open conversation, and there's obviously more that we can do. Perhaps I'll just pause there, Andrew.
Thanks, Frank. In your disclosure too, like a lot of energy companies moving to digital platforms, obviously to spread that message out far and wide, and obviously it's more efficient for you as well. Are you seeing though an emerging trend around digital disadvantage? So it's groups of customers who don't get access to that, and therefore is there a risk that they fall through the cracks of not being able to get access to digital information?
Yeah, look, I think undoubtedly that's an area of concern. There are practical steps that we've thought about. As we do move to digital platforms, we still retain, the ability to, conduct business by phone and voice, which I think alongside that becomes important. There are little practical steps. I mean, it's a big problem, but, through Voices for Power and some of the work that we do with Uniting, but potentially more Voices for Power, where we've got trainers that we're actually putting in that position. It's a small step to think once they've dealt with energy systems, the who's who, and efficiency, and got base level of education there. Could they extend that to actually looking online at bills and starting to interrogate that and helping people work through that? The other practical thing that we've done is we've donated about, I think, nearly 600 PCs and refurbished laptops and refurbished tablets to various organisations, and they've found a way to residential customers, and maybe in some cases the first time, that actually owned something that's allowed them to connect to the internet on a permanent basis. So, there's the two areas, but that is, I think, certainly a cause. An area that we need to continue to focus on.
Hope they're all virus free, Frank.
I hope so as well.
Cass probably wants to ask a couple of questions as well. One further thing, as I mentioned at the start, you're one of the great champions of Better Together initiatives, and a number of the initiatives that would have started it in Jemena have actually ended up being Better Together initiatives, which is fantastic. How much better are those projects because they are, part of the Better Together initiative, and therefore I assume lifting as many boats as we possibly can rather than just the boats in your pond. So can you sort of elaborate on to why most of a lot of the flagship stuff is happening through Better Together, and what is the true value of it?
So there's a really, really good example of that, I think, in the relationship that we've had with Uniting. And, there'll be other examples, but this is our specific example. And I think it's nice that this has come into, being through the course of this year. But we've had that relationship with Uniting for 5 or 6 years. As I say, we're now going into the third iteration of that, which is now, bespoke. But we have introduced Uniting to the Energy Charter. And so there are a number of other businesses that will now, in their own different jurisdictions, be looking to work with Uniting, building off the lessons that we've developed with them over the last 5 to 6 years. And they'll come back the other way as well. So Uniting is in a really, I think, good position to be able to disseminate, experiences backwards and forwards across a number of different jurisdictions. And, I'll say network businesses that are focused on, providing advice and information into customers in a more sensitive way. So we sort of started that relationship. The Energy Charter and the platform that it's, created has allowed us to put it in there. A number of, businesses have seen that could fit with the way that they want to approach customers. And so there's a multiplier impact that'll go across the country as a result of that being picked up, which I think is fantastic. The other thing that it's led to, which there's a number of companies that, and I think we're all in that space in the Energy Charter looking at what we can do around vulnerable customers. And we recognise that as much as we have done, there's still a big gap in terms of making sure that all customers are availing themselves of the existing support. And on the back of, of research that we've done on the back of the Uniting relationship, we've now put, I think collectively, the signatories of the Energy Charter have put 1.5 million across the members to actually focus on getting as much effort and focus on bringing that vulnerable group of customers up to a point where they are availing themselves of, the support that is there. And we think that's the very first and essential step before we think about other things. So I think the multiplier is really, really important through the platform that the Energy Charter provides.
I'll hand over to Cass now, but I would like to come back to the future of the gas network. Obviously going to be a critical thing with transition, and also your views on potential community batteries inside your electricity network. So Cass, over to you.
Thanks. And look, Frank, wanted to particularly acknowledge and the importance of the vulnerability research that you've really, I know, championed and supported, and it will continue to be a really rich source of data and sharing of, the reality for people's lives and where we need to go next on a whole lot of social policy fronts. I know it's being used in a lot of different contexts. So I really want to, I think it's a really important part of what the signatories have done together to resource and support that interrogation. So I just firstly wanted to pick up on a question we've been putting through the other meetings so far, which is what we see is sort of the size and the scale of the vulnerability that is now faced by groups. And as you probably know, some of that won't surface even now for a while, actually. But what we often have that sort of focus on the more what might be described as sort of behavioural or, individual sort of case management style of, working with a particular customer. But given where we're at with the access to technologies, you'll have seen the recommendations from the panel last year about what we identified as potential sort of big levers to try and prevent escalation of energy debt. What do you now see with the lessons you've learned the experiments, the, you know, trials, the, you know, all hands on deck over the last 12 months as being the big structural changes you would like the signatories to lead on over the next 12 months. So, you know, is it about concessions, making sure that that is built into, you know, every move we make? Is it about the energy efficiency side of making sure that people are using the least energy that they need to meet their essential needs? Is it about you know, smart metering, like in the kind of, if you go to the sort of end consumer customer side of it, with the technologies available now, what do you think are the big levers that we should be, as the signatories, leading on, and also asking government to do its bit if it's policy fixes that you need?
Well, I think in no particular order.
That's fine.
You know, Victoria's fortunate that it's got smart meters, you know, across the state. I think they're almost essential as a means of being able to give real-time information, you know, that will impact on the way that we tariff in due course. So they're almost a critical ticket to join the 21st, 22nd century energy system. And we've got an appalling rollout, I think, across the country. You know, it's basically Victoria and it's sporadic elsewhere. And that's, you know, that's something that I think does need to be addressed. I think in terms of the work that we're already doing, you know, there is a real risk that as we continue to change, as customers are faced with more choice, customers that are already, you know, unable or being left behind will be further left behind, and that's critical. So I think the work that we're doing at the moment, and probably $1.5 million between all the signatories, is important and significant, but there's probably a lot more that could be done in a more systematic, concerted way with government support and state and territory support to actually make sure that you know, we are looking after the most vulnerable, to make sure that we shouldn't have a gap between what they could potentially get and what they're actually getting. That should be zero. They should be getting exactly all the support and concessions that are on the table, and, and at the moment they're not. And
why do you think the concession one is so hard, Frank, and why are we still here with, you know, kind of, gee, wouldn't it be great? And is there something there that the signatories could do as a group to really try and push through what's needed in terms of permissions and regulatory reform if needed?
Well, I think there's the two aspects. I think one is actually the education that we've embarked on, and using people like Uniting Voices for Power, the training, the trainers, to make sure that we can connect with people. We can do so much of that, but I think your point about case management and the individual conversation is something that we've found that we needed to do with the, you know, the arrangements that we've had with Uniting. So there's not only the community sessions, there is the follow-up with individual customers on a one-on-one basis, which becomes important because you know, the community sessions, you know, can be dominated. They don't work for everybody, so you've got to have that approach. I think that sort of becomes important on that side. I think on the sort of regulatory and policy space, you know, we've got to be ahead of the game and be aware of unintended consequences. You know, I think we're starting to address some of those things with the way that we're now starting to look at solar panels and the export service, you know, that we can provide as network businesses for people that are connecting their solar panels to the system. I think recognising that as a commercial service becomes important. You know, there has undoubtedly been a cross subsidy there between people that have solar panels and people that don't, in supporting the overall system. So as we go forward, being aware of, you know, the impacts of regulation. Regulation is set for a particular point in time. Technology is fast overtaking, and we just got to keep reflecting on, you know, how the regulation is serving everybody, including the most vulnerable. So I think a lot of the work that's being done through the ESB and the P2025, trying to get onto the front foot, anticipating how the energy system is going to change, you know, the continuing take up of distributed resources and the implications that flow from that. really, really important work that we should all be drawn into. So certainly within Jemena, I'm very encouraging of people being connected to peak bodies, advisory boards and things that are being set up so that our experiences and observations can, be brought into the, consideration of policy and how we move things forward.
Can I check then, just on the, thanks, Frank, because we'll probably spend a bit more time, I think, on some of the important leadership next over the transition. But just before we move, the sort of the basics on vulnerability, at the energy user group meeting, there was a concern expressed to us about not the charter group not getting seeking input from a broader group about the design of that package. I don't think anybody, Claire and Andrew, said that the initiatives in there were, any of them were bad things, but there was this desire for sort of with a package like that being pulled together, I think the opportunity for a systemic view about, for the dollars that you were making available on the table, how to make the most of those dollars to get the maximum impact, and that the group wanted to be consulted. I just wanted to bring that into this discussion with you, but that might also be something to take off into the sort of CEO Council discussion. Claire, just thinking, just acknowledging the couple of roles you play here, Frank, as well. So that was just, I'm not sure whether any of you were observing that discussion, but that did come through.
Look, Claire, sorry, you go.
No, I was just going to say, did you want to respond to that?
I was just going to say a couple of things. I think, yeah, look, you've got to start somewhere. So you've got to roll out something that you think makes sense. You can't consult the entire customer base. We've certainly, and I think a lot of the businesses are now starting progressively to use their people panels and community groups that they've set up to consult with through the submission to the regulator on an ongoing basis to test things against. And we're certainly in the spirit of doing that. And certainly as we think about our third set of arrangements with Uniting that we're putting in place at the moment, we're clearly recognising that it needs to be iterative, and we need to keep getting the feedback, making the tweaks and the adjustments that we need to, and sort of continuing to make sure that it's relevant for the people that we're trying to get to. And I guess the other thing is we do try and get that feedback, certainly with the Voices for Power, for example. As we've gone through the training of trainers, we've made sure that we've done surveys following that to see how they felt they had improved their knowledge on energy systems or efficiency or bill makeup, and mostly that's been very, very positive. But getting that feedback real time and acting on it becomes important.
Thanks, Frank. And just my last question was with all the lessons that you've learned, both in the sort of the business and also with that particular role that you've importantly played over the last year, have there been any surprises for you in terms of breakthrough moments because of the scale of the challenge, where you think for the panel we should really highlight it and call it out as sort of a breakthrough that we would want to build on? Because sometimes, as you know, with crises, really important things happen because everybody is really forced to think outside of the usual way of doing things.
Well, I've already said it. I think the take up of the relationship that that a number of businesses will now have with Uniting, and the fact that that's going to multiply from what we originally started off doing in Victoria to probably quite a number of states and territories, I think is really encouraging. So I think if we could look back in a year, 2, 3, to see the 5th iteration of that being done by a number of businesses with Uniting, I think that would be fantastic. And the more we build the base and then start to anticipate future changes, you know, that would be the next iteration of that. So I can see that going on for, many, many years.
Thanks.
Frank, before we perhaps talk a bit more about the transition, I just, to round off that discussion about vulnerability, we know that individual companies can't resolve all the problems. Even the industry combined can't resolve all the problems, and that there are a whole range of players, particularly government, who are key players. And the question is, how much impact can the industry voice have on policymakers? But just in terms of things like energy efficiency, advice and training is very important. But if that advice is going to people who live in poorly insulated homes, who can only afford to buy cheap appliances with high running costs, energy efficiency sort of falls a bit to the side. If you're, and you mentioned renters, people in public housing who can't afford to or aren't able to put solar panels. So what are the answers for this group of people? You've talked about it, the setup of electric vehicle charging stations. There's a whole cohort who by 2050 probably can't afford an electric vehicle. So what do we do about making sure that those people aren't left behind?
Yeah, there's no silver bullet. I think highlighting, in real time or anticipating even better those sorts of areas and the customers and how they might be left behind, I think is important, so that we have visibility, as a country, as a society, if you like, on those issues. And then I think you're right, it's beyond an individual company or an industry to deal with it, because some of these things are, what do we as a society want to do about it? And if we've got the problem in front of us, or we're seeing the problem developing, are we prepared to socialise it in some way in terms of costs and the effort that we put into that? And I think that would be, to me, the very most important step in that, is putting a spotlight on those areas that are here and now and likely to emerge through the change that we're going through.
Thank you. Andrew?
Just a final question on the vulnerability. I know, and forgive me if I've missed it in your disclosure or elsewhere, the Not Before You Disconnect Better Together initiative, it doesn't look like you're part of that. Can you just clarify?
Sean, do you know on that one?
Sorry, the question, Andrew, just about how it works, or? Oh,
no. So it doesn't. So I know how it works, but it doesn't look like Jemena's part of it. Sean, are you part of that initiative?
That's right. So with our gas business in New South Wales and electricity in Victoria, so we have deployed that. I think we might not have been one of the initial founding members, but we have worked with that initiative, and I think it's but that was really a COVID-induced opportunity to recognise that one of the things was that trying to find that final connection point for customers to make contact with their retailers and to be able to leave a communication was a really important piece that can actually get that connection happening and get the customers onto a path of a payment plan with that physical presence, which is really the role that a distributor has to play.
I just didn't see it in your disclosure, Sean. Maybe I missed it.
Yeah, that may be an oversight with us. Calling that out. Yeah,
we can put a tick in that column, then. That's good. Just wanted to clarify.
Sean, will that now become part of your business as usual? A lot of companies have talked about it as a trial, but obviously it's been a very successful trial, both in terms of economics as well as customer advantage. So, is it going to be BAU for you?
Yeah, I think that's certainly the way that COVID's been really, that's sort of the silver lining, I guess, if you can put it that way, rather than saying that COVID's been a good thing. But a lot of the learnings that we've had and opportunities to, need to rethink things differently. And that's one example. How we run planned outages has been another example where we triage all the planned outages to understand when they need to go ahead and be really clear on it. But we've also uplifted the customer communication during that period. And that means that people are better informed through both electronic means, phone calls, carding, about what and why the planned outages are happening and when they're back on supply. And that's been a trigger that's occurred really because of the way that people have been much more stressed and challenged under the COVID circumstance. And I think probably the bigger flow on that some of that's had has also been culturally across the business. And as much as we talk a lot of customer first and customer focused parts, and they're in our, in our values and behaviours across the company, we talk to it. But when you've got real examples that are percolating through the business, I think that has been a great, perhaps lightning rod to help our people focus on what is it like to be in our customers' shoes during these times, and to contribute new ways of responding. And we've got a number of examples where people have gone, will go above and beyond, and either explain and provide a letter handwritten in Greek by one of our people for a customer who can't understand what's happening with a planned outage situation, or someone who after hours organises a battery for someone who's going to go through a planned outage, and some of those things that are drawn out. So we talk about what we want to do, but it's when we actually see these things happening that I think it's really been a trigger that's uplifted the what we would want to see as a cultural priority around customer focus in the business as well.
Thanks.
Thanks, Sean. We can't let a gas network go by without asking, I guess, the big ugly transition question of, if we are moving to net zero, which we are, and how quickly is, probably sooner rather than later. Some would say that that does not include gas in pipelines. And I know Jemena particularly has been looking at renewable gases and hydrogen to be the replacement for methane. And that seems to be that's the strong focus, and I can completely understand why. But as a safety net, as a backstop to that for consumers, if hydrogen doesn't come along in the time frame or at the price that you hope it will, how do we deal with stranded asset risk of particularly gas networks? And how do we deal with those customers who may remain on the remaining gas network? So there'll be people who might fully electrify because they can, but there'll be people stuck on, using the existing gas space heater or whatever it may be, wearing a bigger and bigger share of that bill. Have you thought much about how we manage that sort of plan B, which no one really wants to think about?
I think, Andrew, we're very much focused, I think, to your point on, how we get to net zero by 2050. I think we're firmly of the view that, the challenge is pretty formidable, and you need both the electricity and the gas industries playing their part. I personally don't think any one of them can do it, by themselves. I say that if you had a blueprint for what you needed to do on the electricity side today, you would probably struggle to put it in place by 2050. The challenge is that formidable, and the last 20% of getting to the hard to abate areas, yep, and something that you can't is going to be really, really impossible. So we are very much in the camp that we need to repurpose and make sure that we're doing what we can to make sense of the gas infrastructure and to complement what we're doing on the electricity side. So the Malabar project, which is a biogas project, is something that we've committed to with ARENA. We've got the Western Sydney Green Gas Project, which is a hydrogen electrolyser project that we're using to actually blend small amounts of hydrogen into the network. Really, really important demonstration projects. We are very firmly of the view that gas is going to be around in 2050 and is going to need to be part of the mix. All the forecasts and scenario work that I see certainly has it coming down, depending which of the scenarios you might look at, but it's certainly part of the mix. And we are currently studying the biogas potential in New South Wales. Our view is that probably what exists there may actually match close to what we supply residential customers in New South Wales. It's close to 30 petajoules per annum. So, you could envisage a scenario where 30 petajoules per annum goes to the residential customers, the industrial customers, where you can actually capture CO2 as it's burnt, could be the subject of CCS and, gathering systems taking, through pipelines back into reservoirs and sort of sequestrating it. So, there's lots of things that still need to play out. So we're kind of focused on that. I think if you do get to a point where you've got stranded assets, it then falls to where do who picks up the cost of that? Is it equity in terms of proponents? Is it the customers through the regulatory framework? Is it the broader tax base through accelerated depreciation, and what does that look like? So I think that's something that we certainly have on our radar, but I think our focus is looking at what the rest of the world is doing. Europe is certainly putting a lot of money into hydrogen. Even in its Green Deal, has recognised the importance of gas playing its role. And I think our challenge is to make sure that we can repurpose infrastructure, we can demonstrate, a biogas industry. I'm not going to, in any way at all, kind of bet against humanity being able to solve the problem of hydrogen in the next 30 years. I use the example of, World War II started in 39, and 30 years later, we're putting a man on the moon. Nobody would have envisaged that when when World War II started in 39 with the invasion of Poland. So, 30 years is a long time. And I think, the bets that are being put on hydrogen are global, and they're running into billions, if not trillions. So I think, there's every reason to believe that, Australia will play a part in that. I think the key to hydrogen for me is, the scale, and that probably comes with us sort of taking up the export opportunity and putting green hydrogen into places like Korea and Japan. And then off the back of that, benefiting domestically because we can get the costs down through the scale.
I hope you're right, Frank. Otherwise, we do have a lot of steel and polyurethane in the ground that we may not need. I guess that there's from a customer's perspective, we kind of get caught between two great movements at the moment. It's the electrify everything movement and the hydrogen superpower movement. So it's a little bit difficult for us to sort of conceptualize who's going to win and what happens, and is there a happy medium somewhere. So I'd be really interested in having that conversation with all of industry as to how we actually make sure that we don't overspend on either of those grand plans, because consumers will end up paying for it.
Well, absolutely. It is a little bit of a conundrum. I think and we did some work with Frontier Economics that was supported by quite a number of, I think, peak bodies representing gas industry, but it was independent. And, that showed that if you looked at a hybrid, pathway to net zero that included renewable gas, compared that to a fully electrified pathway, the difference in 2050 was about 13 billion per annum. The issue is there's a hell of a cost associated with electrification. And what you need to do is take a leap of faith in hydrogen to assume and be able to play its part. But, that's why we need to keep all of our options open and ensure that we're not cutting off anything before we get, the evidence to suggest that things may not work.
Yeah, it's going to be an exciting time. Let's put it that way, to see what happens, because we don't want to be building lots of transmission lines, for example, assuming we're going to be 100% renewables or electrify everything. Then all of a sudden, hydrogen comes down to $1.50 a kilo, and that's where we're going to head. So that's obviously the great unknown that we're trying to understand.
Yeah. Claire, were you wanting to?
I was just going to say we're rapidly running out of time, and do you have any last questions? So,
only the really easy one, Frank, which is as we have these debates, and they still are, sadly, in some debates about what the next phase looks like on sort of energy system and supply and mix. What do you see as being the biggest risk for people and SMEs, in terms of the supports and infrastructures available to them? What we're very worried about, of course, is that with the rapid changes, even if it's not a transition to, access to technologies, that the people who are least resourced are the ones left in so many different ways behind. And as a group of signatories and for your, business specifically, what do you think are the most important issues from the end user point of view for not just discussions to be had, but solutions to be fixed as quickly as possible?
I think it's one of the putting yourselves in the shoes of customers is really important. So we're here to serve customers.
Yeah.
I think first and foremost. So adopting that customer-centric approach. I think the C&I sector, the commercial, that's more, let's just say the SME sector is really quite interesting, and probably be very interesting over the next year or two as it comes out of where we've been. But I think what is also interesting in that space, I think, is the ability to configure distributed energy resources, whether they be batteries, solar panels, combinations, linking it to the grid, and doing it in a way that makes sense not only for the grid but for the individual customer, and where a small business may not be able to pay for that, providing it as a service, because I suspect technology will get to a point where that could be provided at a lower cost than might be there at the moment. It just needs to be configured and provided as a service. So there may be solutions as we go forward that we can look at, but I think always thinking from the point of view of a customer, and complexity and choice will be there in droves, I think, as we go forward. How do they work through that? And I do think network businesses, given that we are covered through a regulatory framework, can almost stand aside and give a fairly objective view to what makes sense and doesn't make sense, both from a grid point of view and an individual customer's point of view.
And you sort of put your customer as the low income house, in terms of residential and a rental property, and SMEs that are in a similar situation, because they're the ones that we can see structurally are going to be harder. So thank you, that's really useful. Thanks.
Well, and thank you, Frank, for helping us to end on a slightly optimistic note about the future. So thank you again for your time, for the very helpful discussion today, and for your disclosure. And we will meet you again when we complete our report. So thank you, all of you, for today's meeting.
Thanks, Frank. Thanks, Sean. Thanks, Hanson.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.